Thank you very much indeed, Quentin, and I'd also like to thank the organisers of the session. This is a really timely point at which to discuss antibiotic resistance, because it is something a little bit like climate change that affects every single one of us and will affect us in more and more unpleasant ways if we don't kind of wake up to the issue, particularly now. So the title of my talk, do you want to talk by carelessness? Do you want to die by carelessness? Okay, don't ever talk carelessly. Careless talk costs lives. So do you want to die by carelessness? I mean this because if we think about antibiotics that many of us will have used in our lifetime, and so actually let's just do a vote, not by go vote this time. Hands up if you've never had antibiotics. Not a single person. So every one of us has had antibiotics during our lifetime. And if you look globally across how antibiotics are used and at what time in life, they're being used earlier and earlier in people's lives, and they're used more and more routinely. In some places worldwide, we have restrictions that antibiotics have to be prescribed, and some places they are over-the-counter use, and you can just go in, buy antibiotics, and self-prescribe. Now, I don't know how many of you yesterday went to the talk, superb talk by Hans Rosling. He was talking about population, and one of the things that was interesting in that talk is he put up information about how we die. And we used to die, so in the 19th century and before, the most common cause of death was probably through infection. And that's how we died. And one of the reasons we see a great increase in our lifespan is two things he mentioned: antibiotics and soap. Okay, both really important. And that's what makes the difference. And we've benefited hugely from that. And that's partly responsible for not just the crowded room, but our crowded planet, is that we have antibiotics and we have used them in many ways very effectively. But let's just look forward and see who is now concerned about our use of antibiotics. So is this just a small group of academics, or are we thinking about large groups, world organizations, WHO, the G20, the G7, who recently talked about antibiotic resistance as being a key issue that has to be addressed, along with others such as climate change. So it's fair to say that awareness really is moving up the agenda, and we've all heard of antibiotic resistance. But if you go to general practitioner surgery, and I have to admit, this was in the UK, not in Belgium, and I went into doctor's surgery and I was really doing a bit of an experiment. And what I went in, I described some symptoms, and what I said is, I think I need some antibiotics. And I got some antibiotics. Now that was very interesting to me because I didn't need any antibiotics. I did have the symptoms. But I just went in, and a busy doctor just had a thought and thought, yeah, we'll just give her antibiotics, because from the doctor's point of view, he thought there wouldn't be any side effects. And actually the side effects for me as the patient might be quite small. The side effects for all of you could be quite large. And that's what we need to think about with antibiotic resistance. So our awareness is increasing. We've all heard of this, but somehow there's no sense of urgency. So for me, in this context, it's exactly like climate change. We know there's a problem. It could be catastrophic for us as human beings. And yet, is anything really happening? So what is it that we're doing? As I've mentioned, worldwide global organizations, governments are all thinking about this, and there are a number of activities or policy actions which are being addressed. So the first one is, how do we avoid what I just described, a personal anecdote? but nevertheless it happened. How do we avoid the over-prescription of antibiotics? How do we start regarding antibiotics, which are in many cases cheap to prescribe? How do we prevent them being used when they are really not necessary, when it's not a case actually of life and death? How do we get that thinking to be endemic in our medical environment, but also in our animal husbandry? Because what many people, we all know we've probably taken antibiotics, what we probably don't know is that many of the farm animals that we might eat unless we're vegetarian, that those farm animals have been subjected to antibiotic treatment, but not because they're suffering from any disease. It's because by giving almost prophylactic or preventative antibiotic, what you're doing is increasing yield of the animals. And this, of course, also means increase in profit. Now, if you have animals in the environment and you're giving antibiotics, I'm a molecular biologist, I'm a microbiologist. So what I know is that what microbes are really, really good at is evolving and generating resistance. And what you do is if you give them something that's unpleasant, they immediately try to evolve, and very quickly indeed, to be able to overcome that barrier to growth so they can avoid it. Now, it's absolutely natural. So for microbiologists, antibiotic resistance is not a surprise. It's an inevitable consequence of using antibiotics. And if we use them widely in animal husbandry, where they're less controlled than for human use, then we have a compounding problem. So we should be thinking about prevention. We don't need to use antibiotics as much as we do. We need to think about education. So I think that we should start thinking about antibiotics as treatment of last resort. So if we have a problem, we need to consider how can we deal with the problem. I'm not suggesting we put lives at risk, but I think that we have to have a really strict number of boxes we have to tick before we will allow prescription of antibiotic. We also need to think about generating new antibiotics or alternative treatments. And this is an issue that I'm sure will come up in questions and discussion, because actually some of our policy inadvertently, so it's an unintended consequence of policy, is preventing the development of new antibiotics. Because if I am a big company, I want to develop a new antibiotic, but the regulations say that no new antibiotic can be used until we've used every other existing antibiotic as treatment, and only then could we consider this newly developed antibiotic. The market is very small for me, so the cost of development's very big, and my market's very small, so I'll go and do something else, which is more profitable, because most pharmaceutical companies are looking at profits for shareholders. So this is a big issue, this new antibiotics. So we need to think about how we address that. We need more research and development, and this is where I might mention in the European Union, the Innovative Medicines Initiative. So this is where we get, in this case, the European Commission to work with drug companies to try and share the risk of developing new drugs, in this case, new antibiotics. And actually, I think it's a great initiative. It's moving in the right direction. It's probably not nearly big enough, and it needs to be much more systemic that we see these partnerships globally. And of course, more international communication. So is this the real problem then? I think that probably what we are looking at, actually I find myself saying probably all the time when I'm here in the Carlsberg Brewery, and I think this is, I don't know why, I don't usually say it, but probably this is the problem. It is about money, because we're talking about drugs that are developed by companies that need profit. And we are now in a very confused situation where we need much more clarity to be able to develop drugs which we need, but not put at risk the very people we are trying to protect. So, lastly, we do need to think about new alternatives, because I've mentioned the vast array of traditional antibiotics that we have and that we approach. But also, we might look at other ways to address the problem. So in this case, using viruses or bacteriophage to attack the bacteria that are affecting us. We have come a long way since the development of penicillin. Remembering that, penicillin was only Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin in 1928, and it wasn't until the 1940s that antibiotics became commonly used. So we should be truly terrified that over such a short period of time, we now face what potentially could be an unmitigated disaster if we don't address this problem and get things right. Looking at the priorities, it is interesting to have a look at who dies from what, and actually this is very small for you. So the big thing on the left is that's people dying from hunger. Okay, so that's how most people die. But then if you have a look at next, HIV, AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, and so on, we live in the environment and we suffer from those diseases that we get from the environment and how we live. So we need to make sure we don't compromise our ability. We've got a big task on the left-hand side, I have to say, but that's not the topic of today's discussion. But on the right-hand side, that's our real task. That's what we're looking at, huge cause of mortality. So what we need to do, and this is my final comment, is that we need to rethink. Initially, medicine was very much the alchemy view and the laying on of hands and so on. We've moved a long way until then. So nowadays, with intensive care, this is not an uncommon sight that we might see on the right-hand side. Antibiotics are crucial to allow us to address these issues. And many of you won't be aware that a lot of people who have cancer and HIV actually die of antibiotic resistance as part of their treatment. And so I think that in order not to condemn ourselves to moving back in this direction, this is not ideal on the right-hand side, but it does give us an idea of the sophistication of what we can achieve. We must not get this simple thing wrong, this very simple thing, which is responsible use of antibiotics and coherent development and policy generation for effective use of new drugs as they come on the market. If we do that, we have a chance. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. We've got a couple of minutes for your points and questions. I've already got several I could ask immediately, but I'd much rather have yours. So, stick your hand up if you've got a question. Excellent.
My name is and I'm one of the people that is really worried about resistance to antibiotics. I'm trying to do my best for it. For now, I have two happy announcements. One that yesterday, 2 days ago, two or three happy announcements. First of all, the ERC, the European Community Commission, decided to launch a new program for antibiotics resistance starting last November. So I think that people can apply and think about that. Second, the G8 thought about that they have to do something too, because most of them are European community, but they are Japan and America, so they added. So there is now second initiative. And the third one, I just lost it, but I'll tell you, yesterday, FDA approved a new antibiotic, although the companies did not show that they used everything else. I'll get you the name in a second. Oh, I have Tedizolid.
Okay.
Actually, Ada, your comments are really welcome, and I know that you're very worried about antibiotic resistance. And although I'm happy that the European Commission, through the European Research Council, are sponsoring more research, I'm happy that the G8 have acknowledged that there's a problem and also that the FDA have approved a new drug. The other thing that we need in the mix, and I know you would agree with me, is education, is how we use it. So.
Okay, so.
Absolutely, you're right. I
Yeah.
just wanted to add.
Yeah, yeah.
Adding is good. Again, I'd much rather take your questions than mine, but if nobody's got a hand up, I'm going to plunge in myself. I'm going to give you 3, 2, 1. Ah, you see, it always works. Let me give you a microphone, sir. Hold on.
Yes, this problem, of course, is global, and I was wondering if something happening, for example, in South America, you know, a lot of use, or in China, for example. What the EU is doing to make this, to combat this problem, like globally, and what kind of steps it is taking?
So I guess it's an analogy with the climate change thing you started with,
Yeah.
is people always say, what can we do, and what difference does it make in Europe if we do everything if somebody else doesn't join in?
Okay, so one of the big issues about Europe is that we are the biggest global market in Europe. And because of that, so this is more the economic financial argument, because that we are in that situation, we're lucky because we can drive regulation and use of antibiotics here in Europe. And what I'm hoping is that Europe can also have a leadership role in being able to work with others and export our technology to other places, but also to help formulate global regulation on how we safely and responsibly use antibiotics. It is a bit like climate change. It's not going to be entirely easy, but you're right that it's no good just looking in Europe. We have to look everywhere, because microbes don't stay put. They move with every plane.
Since we have got you on the witness stand, you've sort of described antibiotic overuse as a sort of social disease with the symptoms felt by the wider society. Where do you think the key points are to focus our efforts? Is it on the doctors, the pharmaceutical companies, the politicians, the individual members of the public? We can't do all of them. We have to do bits of all of them, but where are the key points?
Okay, for me, just in very general terms, I think all antibiotics have to be prescription only. I think that if you look at how they are prescribed in medical practice, there need to be a fundamental change in how we use antibiotics, so that there need to be very strict guidelines from medical practitioners in use of antibiotic and when we use them. And the last thing for me, I've just forgotten what the last thing is, Quentin, because you're staring at me. Yes, animal husbandry. How could I forget that?
I often make people forget animal husbandry. It's one of my...
Do you know, this is ridiculous. And a lot of people, particularly in Europe, where we don't suffer food shortage and we get very high quality food most of the time, and we complain about food, whether it's organic or not organic or whatever, we should be out in the streets protesting about the use of antibiotics in animal husbandry. That, for me, is a very big area. It is just not required. But what does it mean if we don't use it? You might have to pay a little more for your food, just a little bit more, but you won't die of carelessness.
Can we again please thank Professor Anne Glover? Thank you, Anne. And actually a double thanks, because she's also